This is Mastercaster, taking you from zero to podcasting hero. And now here is your host, Neil Butler.
In this episode, I'll present some thoughts on the content that you put into your podcast episodes. We can spend as much time as you want talking about how to record and publish a podcast, but without content that is meaningful, relevant, engaging, and entertaining all at the same time, we're wasting our time together. Think about the corporate or club newsletters that people still send out. Some still add value, but the vast majority land in people's email inboxes and get deleted without being read. How many automated emails do you get each day, week, or month that are part of a mailing list that you either can't or can't be bothered unsubscribing from? The reason that people don't read those newsletters before deleting them is that most of the time they don't contain any information that people are interested in reading. This is often due to a few factors. One, the information is irrelevant to the reader. It might be of some interest to the person or organisation who created the content, but not to the reader. Two, the information is bland and uninteresting. The reader knows that from previous editions, the content won't be terribly engaging. And three, the information is full of what I might call puffer text, stuff that's been added to make the effort of sending the newsletter worthwhile. Let's investigate these points and understand what each one means for your podcast content. Firstly, the content is irrelevant for the listener. This is why it's so important to understand who your audience is and what they want to hear in your podcast. Going back to our example of a podcast about investment, if your audience is primarily younger people, there's more value in discussing long-term investment strategies, whereas if the audience is an older demographic, you might include content that relates to certainty of retirement income. If you don't include content that hits the mark with your audience, they'll stop listening. If you try to be all things to all people, that is, you don't even try to target a particular audience, you're going to find it impossible to engage your listeners. Let's suppose your podcast is about fitness and you don't narrow your focus. You'll end up with some content for marathon runners and some for older people who just want tips on maintaining their fitness. How is that going to engage a regular audience? You are far, far better to target an audience and create content that is relevant to them. Yes, you might lose the marathon runners from your podcast audience, but you'll build a group of older listeners who want to stay fit. If you're that keen to engage a broader group, create multiple podcasts, each one targeting a different demographic. Next, the information is bland and uninteresting. The quickest way to turn people off your podcast is to make it dreary and uninteresting. Think about the presentation of the content. Are you creating the vocal equivalent of 12-point Times New Roman text that just sounds the same every time without any light and shade? Well, one of the easiest ways to create light and shade is to create the podcast as a conversation between two presenters. In some cases, that will be a co-hosting arrangement where the presenters discuss the topic and in effect the listeners are eavesdropping on their chat. In other instances, the host will be interviewing an expert on their chosen topic. In this case, the host needs to allow the expert to present their opinion or knowledge while making sure that they stay on track. People will lose interest if the podcast drags on and on with the same uninteresting voice. And finally, the relevant information is lost in a sea of puffer text. Think back to the newsletter example again. Edition 1 typically sets the scene for the newsletter. Editions 2 and 3 serve their purpose, but by the time we get to edition 4 or 5, we've had to resort to staff profiles outlining their favourite holiday destination or pizza variety. This typically occurs when there's no clear strategy and when a specific frequency has been announced. If the newsletter is produced on the first Thursday of the month and goes for 4 pages, we have to find sufficient content to fill those 4 pages every 30 days. And if we can't, we'll invent content to fill the void, like staff profiles about holidays and pizzas. It's exactly the same when it comes to creating a podcast. If you commit to a weekly podcast that goes for 30 minutes, you're making a commitment that doesn't allow much wriggle room. I'm not saying you shouldn't aim to have a consistent frequency and duration, but don't overcommit, or else sooner or later you'll be filling your episodes with puffer content. Here are some tips that will help you in creating content that is relevant, interesting, and free from puffer content. Don't commit yourself to a frequency or a duration that you can't deliver on. For example, calling your podcast the Power Hour or Investment Daily doesn't give you much wriggle room when developing content. Aim for consistency of episode duration rather than fixed durations. If you aim to have 15-minute episodes, allow yourself the flexibility to create episodes that go for between 10 and 20 minutes. You'll be amazed at how much less pressure you'll be under when you are creating each episode. Include guests or co-hosts. While you may very well be an expert in your specialist area of knowledge, having someone to share the conversation provides the light and shade that's necessary to keep listeners coming back. Yes, I know I'm doing this by myself, but you'll notice I'm also keeping the episodes relatively short. Plan well ahead. If you can, have your content planned well in advance. If you're engaging guests for episodes, make sure that you have the next 5 or 6 guests identified. There is nothing worse than having to rush around at the last minute trying to find someone to be your guest. It will very quickly become the equivalent of pizzas and holiday destinations. If your podcast is not dependent on a timeline, record your episodes well in advance so that you always have a few weeks' worth of content already completed, so that if something comes up, you can still have fresh, regular content being distributed to your subscribers. Now, this is more challenging if your podcast is timeline dependent, for example, discussing the upcoming round of football. However, the principle is the same. If you have a regular co-host, then make sure that they are as committed to the production schedule as you are. If you are bringing in different guests to help you with each episode of your podcast, make sure that you've got them lined up weeks in advance to avoid the last-minute panic that will otherwise happen. As mentioned at the start of this episode, the one single factor that will cause your audience to engage or not is the content that you produce. Unless you invest an appropriate amount of time and effort in planning that content, your podcast will fail. In the next episode, we'll start to consider how you create your content, recording and editing the audio files that will become the episodes of your podcast.
This has been another episode of Mastercaster. For more information about Mastercaster or the other services provided by Untypical Media, please visit www.mastercaster.co or follow Mastercaster on Facebook and LinkedIn.